Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's actually dry out there. On Monday, we were talking about American involvement in the Mexican Revolution. And as I pointed out, after Carranza assumed power, we cut off arms shipments to Mexico and eventually get embroiled in an argument with Pancho Villa, one of Carranza's generals. And in retaliation, he kills 16 Americans in Mexico and then raids Columbus, New Mexico. Wilson pressures the Mexican government into allowing an expedition force to go into Mexico to find Pancho Villa. So in March of 1916, a 5,000-man force under Brigadier General Blackjack Pershing, remember him from the Spanish-American War? Helped lead the African-American troops up to charge up San Juan Hill. He's now a Brigadier General. Now, trying to find Pancho Villa in the northern Mexican desert, where he grew up and where everybody loved him, was virtually impossible. We never catch up with him. We do get in some firefights with some of his men, but we also do that with us running around Mexico. Once to leave, friction develops, and we ended up fighting a couple times the Mexican army. And by January of 1917, we had Mexico. And we never do find Pancho Villa. He's eventually, not long afterwards, about 6 years later, assassinated, probably on the orders of the Mexican government. Now, it had two results. One, it leaves American and Mexican relations extremely strained, close to breaking diplomatic relations. And secondly, it demonstrated that the Army was woefully unprepared to fight a war. So we learned that we weren't really ready to get involved in a great war, at least not yet. And as the war dragged on, the number of deaths and casualties mounted, Wilson continued to try and keep the U.S. neutral, and he was trying to be a peacemaker, broker a deal between the Allies and the Central Powers. But at this point, too many of them have spent too much blood and treasure. They weren't willing to call it quits, and both sides had tremendous demands on what they wanted out of the war. So any attempt by the United States or other nations to mediate failed. Both sides believed they had to get something out of this or it would have been a loss. Total loss. And the American public was still generally against war. Now, many high-ranking Republicans favored American involvement in the war. As you might suspect, Teddy Roosevelt did. That's a shock, isn't it? Leonard Wood also did, and Henry Stimson, and that's a name that'll crop up in here later. He will play a key role in World War II in FDR's government. But they're all advocating for eventual American intervention. Many of them and others that believe in intervention begin to getting the United States ready to fight a war. They formed organizations such as the American Rights Committee and the National Security League. Leonard Wood, who is a serving military officer, even starts his own volunteer officers training camp at Plattsburgh, New York. How many of you guys would want to voluntarily spend your summer going through unofficial officer training? A lot of people did. A whole lot of people did. Wilson, sensing the mood of the nation, a good politician, he was good at that, begins to endorse preparedness. Even though he's against war, there's nothing wrong with being prepared. So in March 1916, Congress passes the National Defense Act, increases the size of the regular army to 2 million men, quadruples it basically. It integrates the National Guard into the overall defense structure. And it creates the Reserve Officer Training Corps, the ROTC, to use college campuses to train college students to be future officers. It'll be used in World War I, World War II, Korea, quite controversially in Vietnam, and it's still around today. UC has its own ROTC. And to pay for it, Congress will raise taxes on the wealthy and on the munitions industry, which had been prospering due to the slaughter in Europe. That same year, Wilson runs for re-election. And even though he's endorsed preparedness, his campaign slogan is, quote, "He kept us out of war." And by the way, Teddy Roosevelt criticized him heavily. Teddy Roosevelt basically replied, another slogan of his was, "A man can be too proud to fight." So Wilson truly wanted to keep the United States out of the Great War. And I'll argue in here that he was, good morning, that he was not deceiving the American public when he said that. Even though within a month of his re-inauguration, he'll go to Congress and ask for war. Now, his Republican opponent was a Supreme Court justice, former one, left to run, Charles Evans Hughes. And Hughes, like Wilson, was a progressive. Unlike Wilson, he favored American intervention. He was backed by Teddy Roosevelt, it's a close election. Wilson wins with 49.4% of the popular vote. Hughes got 46.2%. And it was close in the Electoral College, 277 to 254. And again, elected are beginning to change in Europe. So far, it's been roughly 3 years of bloody stalemate. And I mean bloody. Thousands of those were killed. Can you imagine that? 40,000 people killed in a single day. Yes, sir.
I thought you said 20.
20,000 were killed. 4,000 casualties. Casualty is killed, wounded, or missing.
Pretty even number.
Yeah, it is. It shows you that normally the ratios are much higher for those wounded and killed. And it depends on the war, it's usually like 6-to-1, 7-to-1. Not World War I, with the kind of tactics and weapons they were using. It was mass slaughter. The Germans, not having much luck on the Western Front, did eventually have a lot of luck on the Eastern Front. The Russians, who botched their war effort, weren't all that well prepared for it in the first place. Their leadership was horrible. Czar was a horrible leader. Eventually, the Russian war effort collapsed. And by late 1916, early 1917, the Germans realized they could knock the Russians out of the war. At this time, the Russians in the East and the French and British in the West. They knocked Russia out of the war. They can focus all of their forces now on the Western Front. They develop a plan, basically, to, quote, bleed France and starve Britain. Once they knock Russia out of the war, which they will do very soon, but that'll lead to the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise of communism, the Soviet Union, all sorts of repercussions down the road, which we shall see. But once they knock them out of the war, they're going to launch a series of offensives in the East to basically bleed the French army. And to knock the British out of the war, they plan on resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, which they decide to do in January of 1917. The difference now between when they had done it originally in 1914, early 1915, they only had 27 U-boats back then. Now they have 200. In fact, now they can keep 75 of them out at sea at any one time. They're bigger, they're faster, they're more powerful. So the Germans now have the capability, possibly, to sink enough ships to starve England out. Now they know that could possibly draw the United States into the war. Why aren't they worried about that? They're pretty sure that this is going to be the catalyst to bring us in. Why don't they care?
What's that? Sorry.
The Germans know that resuming unrestricted submarine warfare is likely to bring the United States into the war. Why don't they care, though? You think that would be a major consideration? It was, but ultimately, why did they decide that it doesn't matter?
They probably think they're underestimating us, obviously.
Great, that's number one right there. They underestimate us. They know we're a great industrial power, but they don't take our military seriously. Compared to theirs, compared to the warring powers, at this point, it's tiny, it's primitive, and it's amateurish. So yeah, they underestimate us. One other factor. They figure it'll take the United States a good year before we can actually gear up, raise an army, and make a difference in Europe. And by the way, they were right. By the time we declare war in April of 1917, and by the time we have significant forces to make a difference over there, it's well over a year later. So they weren't wrong about that. What they were wrong about was their ability to knock out Great Britain and France in that year. That's where they failed. By the way, you can kind of thank the British Army for that, because the French Army had been told. It was the British Army that stepped into the breach and carried the brunt of the war for a while until we got involved. So the Germans know it's a calculated risk, and it's likely to bring us into the war. In February of 1917, due to this, the United States severs all diplomatic relations with Germany. We send their ambassador home, they send ours home. Wilson makes it clear, though, that he still hopes to avoid war with them. But he has now taken a major step. You do not sever diplomatic ties with another nation unless you're basically on the brink of war with them. And here's German U-14. These boats were a lot, like as I pointed out, a lot deadlier than the early ones. Now, the straw that's going to break the camel's back is going to be a telegram. 3 weeks after we sever diplomatic ties with Germany, Great Britain presents us with a telegram. In fact, a decoded copy of one. It was sent by the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann, and a foreign minister is the equivalent of our Secretary of State. That's just another term for a Secretary of State. It was sent by the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. And it has profound repercussions that will let you discover for yourself. Now tell me if this doesn't scream war. Doesn't that infuriate you?
Is that scrambled code?
Yeah, that's the original coded version. This might help. This is the decoded version. Tell me what the Germans are up to. Sorry. Sorry about that. What would you folks do if you were Woodrow Wilson? What's Germany up to?
I get Mexico to fight us with them, take back to Texas and whatnot.
Yeah. By the way, what other country do they seek to involve? Isn't that interesting? Country we will go to war with in the Second World War. Ironically, in World War I, Japan was an ally. They were one of the few countries Britain had a defense treaty with. And when World War I broke out, Japan declared war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. They even sent a few warships to help patrol the Mediterranean. Yeah,
That's why Wilson asked to go, what he said.
please.
This is why Wilson goes,
This is the straw that breaks the camel's back, the so-called Zimmerman telegram, yeah. And by the way, the Japanese met secretly with the Germans in Stockholm and listened politely to their offer, but turned them down. But it shows you that as early as 1917, relations between the United States and Japan were already getting a bit strained, and other nations recognized that. But anyway, if you're Wilson, what do you do after this? He still hesitated, I might add, for a couple of weeks until the Germans sank 3 American merchant ships. So that's when Wilson finally decided that the United States had to go to war. And by the way, the Mexican government turned this down, hands down. They had no interest whatsoever in the German offer. That's the infamous Zimmerman program. Now, by this point, public opinion changed as well. And the majority of Americans now favored going to war. 6 months earlier, that had not been the case. Wilson, as I pointed out, like most progressives, with some exceptions, hated war. But they also believed in fighting for a just cause, that there were such things as a just war. And by the way, military historians look at it the same way. When we study war, we don't look to see if war is a good war or a bad war, because ultimately no war is good. But we try and decide sometimes if it was a just war or not, if the war had to be fought, if the principles or the reasons you were fighting it for overrode other concerns. And in many ways, World War I would fit that pattern as a just war. If you look at other wars, Vietnam, probably not, quite frankly. World War II, without a doubt, a just war. So even though we hated war, alcohol. No overt German action directly. Ensure peace in the future. He said, quote, "You have no selfish democracy versus autocracy. The United States had to help, quote, we went to war for the freedom of the seas. a war to end all wars.
Wilson elaborates on these ideals and a specific war aims several months later in what are known as his 14 points. He announces those in January of 1918, but it goes right along with his war message to Congress and what he thought reasons the United States should be in this war. Under his 14 points, Wilson wanted to end secret treaties, which was the cause of World War I. He wanted total freedom of the seas, an end to economic barriers between nations. Economic rivalry was a major factor in causing World War I. And self-determination for people. Otherwise, remember I mentioned the nationalism that had helped fuel World War I? He argued that it was only just and right for these various nationalities, these various groups, to have their own nation. There should be a Poland, Serbia, the Czech Republic. So self-determination of peoples is going to be a major most importantly, he was the establishment of what we call a League of Nations, international body similar to the United Nations that through what we call collective security would prevent future wars. So otherwise, the nations of the world would get together in the League of Nations, and if a war broke out, they would band together against the aggressor nation to end it. It was a world effort to peace. Yes, it was a
But obviously it fails miserably, doesn't it? The League of Nations does not prevent the coming of World War II. But anyway, that gives you some idea of why and what we were fighting for in World War I. Unlike the other powers, we weren't fighting for revenge, we weren't fighting for territory, we weren't fighting for economic rivalry. We were fighting for noble ideals. And Wilson helps transform that war from a slaughter, for all the things I mentioned above, to something more noble and idealistic. It gave it a great cause for fighting a great war. voting on principles. There's nothing in particular about World War I or II, and she knew we were, she supported World War II, she just didn't vote for it. But even in retirement years later, she led anti-war protests against the Vietnam War. So for the first woman in Congress, she had quite a controversial career and a devoted one. She's past it. And she voted against, one of the few that voted against World War I. Wilson, unlike Roosevelt, had no romantic illusions about it. Beyond all his glory, you understood. Shortly after the vote for war, there was a huge spontaneous parade outside of the White House. Thousands of people showed up and they were cheering. And Wilson was looking out the window of his office, and there was aide was in there. And Wilson, the aide was kind of smiling and pumped up with pride and all that. Wilson looked at him. They don't know what they're cheering about. Don't they realize I've just signed a death warrant for thousands of young American men? By the way, you want to get war leaders? That's a good place to start. You might have a clear eye about what they're getting involved in. So the United States is now committed to the Great War. Are we ready for it? We went more on principle. Other factors contributed as well. As I pointed out earlier, as the war progressed, more and more our economic interests were on the side of the Allies. Our industries were supplying the Allies, our banks were lending them money. The France collapse, for example, the American banks simply dragged us with them. So we had an economic stability. Secondly, thousands of Americans were already fighting in the war. They either went to Canada, volunteered in the Canadian Army. Some of the British Britain. Many enlisted in the French Navy. French had entire air Lafayette Escadrille made up of Americans. And the United States. By the way, here's members of the Lafayette Escadrille. Once the United States got into the war, they were absorbed into the United States Army Air Force. If you notice, I don't have, I have them for my World War I class, but they sometimes do it quite justly. When we get to Vietnam, the people protesting that war had very good reasons for protesting it. Wilson, in the belief the nation should be totally united, had the government go first from promoting the war to silencing all dissent against it. and suppressing constitutional rights of freedom of speech and freedom of press. The German community, and Germans in particular, became the target of community repression and vigilante attacks. Even in places like Cincinnati, where a quarter of the population was either German or second generation American of German heritage, you find repression. By the way, I'm not kidding about the vigilantes. Over 75 people were murdered, lynched around the country by vigilantes who thought they were being patriotic by executing fellow citizens because of their heritage. German language newspapers and other publications were either banned or forced to publish in English. That was the same here in Cincinnati with the Beobachter and the many other German language newspapers. They either shut down or had to publish in English so the censors could read it more easily. In September of 1917, the Cincinnati Public Library bans all books deemed pro-German. And the University of Cincinnati Medical School removed all German medical books from its shelves. And at that point, they might as well shut the doors because the Germans were the leaders in medical science. You can carry this stuff way too far is what I'm getting at. Street names are changed. 13 of them are changed in Cincinnati alone. German Street was changed to American Street. Berlin became Woodrow. Humboldt became Taft. German Street became English Street. By the way, I grew up on the west side of Cincinnati, next to a little city known as Cheviot. They didn't change their names. You drive through Cheviot, you still see a lot of German street names like Koenig and things like that. But in Cincinnati, we went through and changed virtually all of them. Show you how ridiculous it got. In December of 1917, Dr. Ernst Kuhnwald, a native of Austria, and conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, is arrested and interned as an enemy alien in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. You know what his crime was? By the way, he did nothing overt at all. Nothing. He was interned for saying, quote, his heart belonged to the other side. He was thrown in a military prison for over a year and a half for that. By the way, a petition of leading citizens from Cincinnati stated that Kuhnwald was no threat and they would take responsibility for him, but they still wouldn't release him. We all know how dangerous conductors can be. That little pointy stick might hurt somebody. Ohio will eventually pass the Acte law banning the teaching of German in public schools. It goes beyond repressing people of German heritage. In June of 1917, Congress passes the Espionage Act, banned treasonous mail and all interference or criticism of the draft and the military. The Sedition Act made it unlawful to obstruct the sale of war bonds, use disloyal, profane, or scurrilous language against the government, flag, or war. and either anti-war or left-wing journals were banned from the mail. Labor leader Eugene V. Debs is given a 10-year prison sentence for questioning the the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And by the way, at his trial, he endorsed the right of Americans to free speech. Then the judge sentenced him to 10 years in Atlanta Pen, one of the worst hellholes in America. In 1919, in Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court will uphold the Espionage and Sedition Acts, opening the door for the government to curtail civil liberties in future wars. It will never be as bad as it was in World War I. In World War II, the government censored things, but they did it pragmatically. And it had to do with your opinion and more to do with national security, the way it should have been. But they definitely abuse it in World War I. Now, eventually, the United States will prove the Germans wrong when they underestimated us, and we will eventually put 1.2 million fighting men on a 50-mile front in France. And American participation in the war will be decisive. I'm not taking anything away from the British or French. After 4 years of war, they had beaten the Germans down. But that influx of 1 million fresh American soldiers will help turn the tide. But how do we get there from a small, primitive, amateurish army to one that's capable of deciding a world war? It's a long process. By the way, we did have some advantages. Our Navy was already the second largest in the world, second only to Great Britain's. And within about 10 years, we will surpass them as well. And the U.S. Navy will make a huge contribution even early in the war, convoying much needed supplies to Great Britain. It's with the help of the U.S. Navy, Britain finally breaks the U-boats surrounding Great Britain. Another advantage we have is leadership. Even though they've never done anything like this before, the leadership, both civilian and military, is excellent. Wilson will prove to be a very good wartime president, and the War Department will be able to handle the complexities and huge scope of creating a modern army. They will make a horrible mess out of trying to organize the economy for war. Now, as I pointed out, Wilson is going to be an excellent wartime president. Not because he has any military skill. He has none. He knows that. But he's an excellent administrator and facilitator. And he has a good eye for talent. When he picks John J. Pershing, the guy that had led the Expeditionary Force into Mexico, as Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Force, that's the American Army in Europe in World War I, he said, I'm only going to give you 2 orders. I'm going to order you to Europe, and then when the war's over, I'm going to order you to come home. The rest of it, you're on your own, basically. So he's going to let the professionals fight the war. By the way, other great wartime presidents Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt were far more hands-on. But they also had a much better idea of what they were doing when it came to fighting a war. So there are different ways to be a great wartime president. The Secretary of War also has no experience, but will prove to be excellent at his job. Newton D. Baker. He's the American Secretary of War during World War I. And he's the guy that's going to be responsible largely for putting this huge mass army together, equipping it, getting it to Europe efficiently, and make sure that it's capable of prosecuting the war. So again, it's his administrative and political talents that are important. Like I said, he has no experience. You know what his job was previous to being Secretary of War? He was mayor of Cleveland. That's what his job was before Wilson tapped him as Secretary of War.
I thought he ran a parlor. That's what they call it, a parlor.
No.
Maybe that was dead.
So, like I said, he had no experience whatsoever. Unless you consider Cleveland to be a war zone. By the way, here's Newton D. Baker. And here's General John Blackjack Pershing. Now, how is the U.S. going to raise the huge army necessary to fight this war? They're going to raise money with bonds, yeah, but how are they going to raise the manpower? How is Uncle Sam going to raise them?
Description.
And then that picture we want to shoot, more propaganda.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, thank you. It's going to be through the draft. 2/3 of the men that served in World War I will be drafted. And by the way, after the initial rush to enlist, they were overwhelmed. They wanted something a little more orderly. So later in the war, you had to wait to be called up. So 2/3 will be drafted. On the 18th of May, 1917, the Selective Service Act is passed. And the law benefited from abuses in the Civil War. They wanted to make sure they did not repeat the same abuses that the Civil War draft had. To begin with, the draft machinery is in civilian hands, not the military. Secondly, the entire National Guard is called up for federal service. If you're in a Guard unit, you're now in a federal unit. And they do the same thing in World War II. They do not do that, by the way, in Vietnam. All men ages 18 to 30 had to register for the draft. Later on, it was 18 to 45. Bounties and substitutions were prohibited. During the Civil War, you could pay somebody to take your place. Can't do that anymore. And service was for the duration of the conflict. Once you're in till the war is over. By the way, here's a recruiting poster. Germans portrayed as a ravaging ape. And again, the poor, helpless woman image. You ladies should be offended by that. Can you mention Uncle Sam? Here he is.
Is this where it started?
Yep. And we stole it from the British. They had a similar poster, but theirs with their Minister of War on it. And we will fight the war on Friday.